The old city of Angoulême is perched aloft on a crag like a sugar loaf, overlooking the plain where the Charente winds away through the meadows. The crag is an outlying spur on the Périgord side of a long, low ridge of hill, which terminates abruptly just above the road from Paris to Bordeaux, so that the Rock of Angoulême is a sort of promontory marking out the line of three picturesque valleys. The ramparts and great gateways and ruined fortress on the summit of the crag still remain to bear witness to the importance of this stronghold during the religious wars, when Angoulême was a military position coveted alike of Catholics and Calvinists, but its old-world strength is a source of weakness in modern days. Angoulême could not spread down to the Charente, and shut in between its ramparts and the steep sides of the crag, the old town is condemned to stagnation of the most fatal kind. The government made an attempt about this very time to extend the town towards Périgord, building a prefecture, a naval school, and barracks along the hillside, and opening up roads. But private enterprise had been beforehand elsewhere. For some time past the suburb of Lumo had sprung up, a mushroom growth at the foot of the crag and along the river side, where the direct road runs from Paris to Bordeaux. Everybody has heard of the great paper mills of Angoulême, established before 300 years ago on the Charente and its branch streams, where there was a sufficient fall of water. The largest state factory of marine ordnance in France was established at Ruel, some 6 miles away. Carriers, wheelwrights, posthouses, and inns, every agency for public conveyance, every industry that lives by road or river, was crowded together in Lower Angoulême, to avoid the difficulty of the ascent of the hill. Naturally, too, tanneries, laundries, and all such waterside trades stood within reach of the Charente, and along the banks of the river lay the stores of brandy and great warehouses full of the water-borne raw material. All the carrying trade of the Charente, in short, had lined the quays with buildings. So the faubourg of Lumo grew into a busy and prosperous city, a second Angoulême rivaling the upper town, the residence of the powers that be, the lords spiritual and temporal of Angoulême, though Lumo, with all its business and increasing greatness, was still a mere appendage of the city above. The noblesse and officialdom dwelt on the crag, trade and wealth remained below. No love was lost between these two sections of the community all the world over, and in Angoulême it would have been hard to say which of the two camps detested the other the more cordially. Under the Empire the machinery worked fairly smoothly, but the Restoration wrought both sides to the highest pitch of exasperation. Nearly every house in the upper town of Angoulême is inhabited by noble, or at any rate by old burgher, families, who live independently on their incomes, a sort of autochthonous nation who suffer no aliens to come among them. Possibly, after 200 years of unbroken residence, and it may be an intermarriage or two with one of the primordial houses, a family from some neighboring district may be adopted, but in the eyes of the Aboriginal race they are still newcomers of yesterday. Prefects, receivers general, and various administrations that have come and gone during the last 40 years, have tried to tame the ancient families perched aloft like wary ravens on the crag. The said families were always willing to accept invitations to dinners and dances, but as to admitting the strangers to their own houses, they were inexorable. Ready to scoff and disparage, jealous and niggardly, marrying only among themselves, the families formed a serried phalanx to keep out intruders. Of modern luxury they had no notion, and as for sending a boy to Paris, it was sending him, they thought, to certain ruin. Such sagacity will give a sufficient idea of the old-world manners and customs of this society, suffering from thick-headed royalism, infected with bigotry rather than zeal, all stagnating together, motionless as their town founded upon a rock. Yet Angoulême enjoyed a great reputation in the provinces round about for its educational advantages, and neighbouring towns sent their daughters to its boarding schools and convents. It is easy to imagine the influence of the class sentiment which held Angoulême aloof from Lumo. The merchant classes are rich, the noblesse are usually poor. Each side takes its revenge in scorn of the other. The tradespeople in Angoulême espouse the quarrel. He is a man of Lumo, a shopkeeper of the upper town will tell you, speaking of a merchant in the lower suburb, throwing an accent into the speech which no words can describe. When the Restoration defined the position of the French noblesse, holding out hopes to them which could only be realized by a complete and general topsy-turvydom, the distance between Angoulême and L'Houmeau, already more strongly marked than the distance between the hill and plain, was widened yet further. The better families, all devoted as one man to the government, grew more exclusive here than in any other part of France. The man of L'Houmeau became little better than a pariah. Hence the deep, smothered hatred which broke out everywhere with such ugly unanimity in the insurrection of 1830 and destroyed the elements of a durable social system in France. As the overweening haughtiness of the court nobles detached the provincial noblesse from the throne, so did these last alienate the bourgeoisie from the royal cause by behavior that galled their vanity in every possible way. So, a man of L'Houmeau, a druggist's son, in Mme. de Bargeton's house was nothing less than a little revolution. Who was responsible for it? Lamartine and Victor Hugo, Casimir Delavigne and Canalis, Beranger and Chateaubriand. d'Avrigny, Benjamin Constant and Lamennais, Cousin and Michaud, all the old and young illustrious names in literature, in short, liberals and royalists, alike must divide the blame among them. Mme. de Bargeton loved art and letters, eccentric taste on her part, a craze deeply deplored in Angoulême. In justice to the lady, it is necessary to give a sketch of the previous history of a woman born to shine, and left by unlucky circumstances in the shade, a woman whose influence decided Lucien's career. M. de Bargeton was the great-grandson of an alderman of Bordeaux named Mirault, ennobled under Louis XIII for long tenure of office. His son, bearing the name of Mirault de Bargeton, became an officer in the household troops of Louis XIV, and married so great a fortune that in the reign of Louis XV, his son dropped the Mirault and was called simply M. de Bargeton. This M. de Bargeton, the alderman's grandson, lived up to his qualities so strenuously that he ran through the family property and checked the course of its fortunes. Two of his brothers, indeed, great-uncles of the present Bargeton, went into business again, for which reason you will find the name of Mirault among Bordeaux merchants at this day. The lands of Bargeton, in Angoumois in the barony of Rochefoucauld, being entailed, and the house in Angoulême, called the Hôtel Bargeton. Likewise, the grandson of M. de Bargeton the Waster came in for these hereditaments, though the year 1789 deprived him of all seigneurial rights save to the rents paid by his tenants, which amounted to some 10,000 francs per annum. If his grandsire had but walked in the ways of his illustrious progenitors, Bargeton I and Bargeton II, Bargeton V, who may be dubbed Bargeton the Mute by way of distinction, should by rights have been born to the title of Marquis of Bargeton, he would have been connected with some great family or other, and in due time he would have been a duke and a peer of France, like many another, whereas, in 1805, he thought himself uncommonly lucky when he married Marie-Louise Aînée de Nigrepelis, the daughter of a noble long relegated to the obscurity of his manor house, scion though he was of the younger branch of one of the oldest families in the south of France. There had been a Nigrepelis among the hostages of St. Louis. The head of the elder branch, however, had borne the illustrious name of Despard since the reign of Henry IV, when the Nigrepelis of that day married an heiress of the Despard family. As for M. de Nigrepelis, the younger son of a younger son, he lived upon his wife's property, a small estate in the neighborhood of Barbezieux, farming the land to admiration, selling his corn in the market himself, and distilling his own brandy, laughing at those who ridiculed him, so long as he could pile up silver crowns, and now and again round out his estate with another bit of land. Circumstances unusual enough in out-of-the-way places in the country had inspired Mme. de Bargeton with a taste for music and reading. During the Revolution I Abbé Niollant, the Abbé Rosa's best pupil, found a hiding place in the old manor house of Escarbas, and brought with him his baggage of musical compositions. The old country gentleman's hospitality was handsomely repaid, for the abbé undertook his daughter's education. Aînée, or Nise, as she was called, must otherwise have been left to herself, or, worse still, to some coarse-minded servant maid. The abbé was not only a musician, he was well and widely read, and knew both Italian and German, so Mier de Nigrepelis received instruction in those tongues, as well as in counterpoint. He explained the great masterpieces of the French, German, and Italian literatures, and deciphered with her the music of the great composers. Finally, as time hung heavy on his hands in the seclusion enforced by political storms, he taught his pupil Latin and Greek and some smatterings of natural science. A mother might have modified the effects of a man's education upon a young girl, whose independent spirit had been fostered in the first place by a country life. The Abbé Niolant, an enthusiast and a poet, possessed the artistic temperament in a peculiarly high degree, a temperament compatible with many estimable qualities, but prone to raise itself above bourgeois prejudices by the liberty of its judgments and breadth of view. In society, an intellect of this order wins pardon for its boldness by its depth and originality, but in private life it would seem to do positive mischief, by suggesting wanderings from the beaten track. The abbé was by no means wanting in goodness of heart, and his ideas were therefore the more contagious for this high-spirited girl, in whom they were confirmed by a lonely life. The Abbé Nilant's pupil learned to be fearless in criticism and ready in judgment. It never occurred to her tutor that qualities so necessary in a man are disadvantages in a woman destined for the homely life of a house mother. And though the abbé constantly impressed it upon his pupil that it behoved her to be the more modest and gracious with the extent of her attainments, Mié de Negrepilis conceived an excellent opinion of herself and a robust contempt for ordinary humanity. All those about her were her inferiors, or persons who hastened to do her bidding, till she grew to be as haughty as a great lady, with none of the charming blandness and urbanity of a great lady. The instincts of vanity were flattered by the pride that the poor abbé took in his pupil, the pride of an author who sees himself in his work, and for her misfortune she met no one with whom she could measure herself. Isolation is one of the greatest drawbacks of a country life. We lose the habit of putting ourselves to any inconvenience for the sake of others when there is no one for whom to make the trifling sacrifices of personal effort required by dress and manner. And everything in us shares in the change for the worse, the form and the spirit deteriorate together. with no social intercourse to compel self-repression, Mie. And Agripolis's bold ideas passed into her manner and the expression of her face. There was a cavalier air about her, as something that seems at first original, but only suited to women of adventurous life. So this education, and the consequent asperities of character, which would have been softened down in a higher social sphere, could only serve to make her ridiculous at Angoulême so soon as her adorers should cease to worship eccentricities that charm only in youth. As for M. de Negropoulos, he would have given all his daughter's books to save the life of a sick bullock, and so miserly was he, that he would not have given her 2 farthings over and above the allowance to which she had a right, even if it had been a question of some indispensable trifle for her education. In 1802 the abbé died, before the marriage of his dear child, a marriage which he, doubtless, would never have advised. The old father found his daughter a great care now that the abbé was gone. The high-spirited girl, with nothing else to do, was sure to break into rebellion against his niggardliness, and he felt quite unequal to the struggle. Like all young women who leave the appointed track of woman's life, Nais had her own opinions about marriage, and had no great inclination thereto. She shrank from submitting herself, body and soul, to the feeble, undignified specimens of mankind whom she had chanced to meet. She wished to rule. Marriage meant obedience, and between obedience to coarse caprices and a mind without indulgence for her tastes, and flight with a lover who should please her, she would not have hesitated for a moment. M. de Negropoulos maintained sufficient of the tradition of birth to dread a mésalliance. Like many another parent, he resolved to marry his daughter, not so much on her account as for his own peace of mind. A noble or a country gentleman was the man for him, somebody not too clever, incapable of haggling over the account of the trust, stupid enough and easy enough to allow Nais to have her own way, and disinterested enough to take her without a dowry. But where to look for a son-in-law to suit father and daughter equally well, was the problem. Such a man would be the phoenix of sons-in-law. To M. de Negrepilis, pondering over the eligible bachelors of the province with these double requirements in his mind. M. de Bargeton seemed to be the only one who answered to this description. M. de Bargeton, aged 40, considerably shattered by the amorous dissipations of his youth, was generally held to be a man of remarkably feeble intellect, but he had just the exact amount of common sense required for the management of his fortune, and breeding sufficient to enable him to avoid blunders or blatant follies in society in Angoulême. In the bluntest manner, M. de Negrepilis pointed out the negative virtues of the model husband designed for his daughter, and made her see the way to manage him so as to secure her own happiness. So Nais married the bearer of arms, 200 years old already, for the Bargeton arms are blazoned thus: the first or 3 attires gules, the second 3 arxes heads cabosse, 2 and 1, sable, the third, barry of 6, azure and argent, in the first, 6 shells or 3, 2, and 1. Provided with a chaperone, Nais could steer her fortunes as she chose under the style of the firm, and with the help of such connections as her wit and beauty would obtain for her in Paris. Nais was enchanted by the prospect of such liberty. M. de Bargeton was of the opinion that he was making a brilliant marriage, for he expected that in no long while M. de Negrepilis would leave him the estates which he was rounding out so lovingly, but to an unprejudiced spectator it certainly seemed as though the duty of writing the bridegroom's epitaph might devolve upon his father-in-law. By this time Mme. de Bargeton was 36 years old and her husband 58. The disparity in age was the more startling since M. de Bargeton looked like a man of 70, whereas his wife looked scarcely half her age. She could still wear rose color, and her hair hanging loose upon her shoulders. Although their income did not exceed 12,000 francs, they ranked among the half-dozen largest fortunes in the old city, merchants and officials excepted, for M and Mme. de Bargeton were obliged to live in Angoulême until such time as Mme. de Bargeton's inheritance should fall in and they could go to Paris. Meanwhile they were bound to be attentive to old M. de Negrepilis, who kept them waiting so long that his son-in-law in fact predeceased him, and Nay's brilliant intellectual gifts, and the wealth that lay like undiscovered ore in her nature, profited her nothing, underwent the transforming operation of time and changed to absurdities. for our absurdities spring, in fact, for the most part, from the good in us, from some faculty or quality abnormally developed. Pride, untempered by intercourse with the great world, becomes stiff and starched by contact with petty things. In a loftier moral atmosphere it would have grown to noble magnanimity. Enthusiasm, that virtue within a virtue, forming the saint, inspiring the devotion hidden from all eyes and glowing out upon the world in verse, turns to exaggeration, with the trifles of a narrow existence for its object. Far away from the centers of light shared by great minds, where the air is quick with thought, knowledge stands still, taste is corrupted like stagnant water, and passion dwindles, frittered away upon the infinitely small objects which it strives to exalt. Herein lies the secret of the avarice and tittle-tattle that poison provincial life. The contagion of narrow-mindedness and meanness affects the noblest natures, and in such ways as these, men born to be great, and women who would have been charming if they had fallen under the forming influence of greater minds, are balked of their lives. Here was Mme. de Bargeton, for instance, smiting the lyre for every trifle, and publishing her emotions indiscriminately to her circle. As a matter of fact, when sensations appeal to an audience of one, it is better to keep them to ourselves. A Sunset certainly is a glorious poem, but if a woman describes it, in high-sounding words, for the benefit of matter-of-fact people, is she not ridiculous? There are pleasures which can only be felt to the full when two souls meet, poet and poet, heart and heart. It was at this period of her career that she began to typize, individualize, synthesize, dramatize, superiorize, analyze, poetize, angelize, neologize, tragedify, prosify, and colossify. You must violate the laws of language to find words to express the new-fangled whimsies in which even women here and there indulge. The heat of her language communicated itself to the brain, and the dithyrambs on her lips were spoken out of the abundance of her heart. She palpitated, swooned, and went into ecstasies over anything and everything, over the devotion of a sister of charity, and the execution of the brothers Forchet, over M. Darlincourt's Ipsabo, Louise Anaconda, or the escape of La Valette, or the presence of mind of a lady friend who put burglars to flight by imitating a man's voice. Everything was heroic, extraordinary, strange, wonderful, and divine. She would work herself into a state of excitement, indignation, or depression. She soared to heaven, and sank again, gazed at the sky, or looked to earth. Her eyes were always filled with tears. She wore herself out with chronic admiration, and wasted her strength on curious dislikes. Her mind ran on the Pasha of Janina. She would have liked to try conclusions with him in his seraglio, and had a great notion of being sewn in a sack and thrown into the water. She envied that blue stocking of the desert, Lady Hester Stanhope. She longed to be a sister of Saint Camilla and tend the sick and die of yellow fever in a hospital at Barcelona, at Vassar High, a noble destiny. In short, she thirsted for any draught but the clear spring water of her own life, flowing hidden among green pastures. She adored Byron and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or anybody else with a picturesque or dramatic career. Her tears were ready to flow for every misfortune. She sang paeans for every victory. She sympathized with the fallen Napoleon, and with Muhammad Ali, massacring the foreign usurpers of Egypt. In short, any kind of genius was accommodated with an aureole, and she was fully persuaded that gifted immortals lived on incense and light. A good many people looked upon her as a harmless lunatic, but in these extravagances of hers a keener observer surely would have seen the broken fragments of a magnificent edifice that had crumbled into ruin before it was completed, the stones of a heavenly Jerusalem loved, in short, without a lover. And this was indeed the fact. The story of the first 18 years of Mme. de Bargeton's married life can be summed up in a few words. For a long while she lived upon herself and distant hopes. Then, when she began to see that their narrow income put the longed-for life in Paris quite out of the question, she looked about her at the people with whom her life must be spent, and shuddered at her loneliness. There was not a single man who could inspire the madness to which women are prone when they despair of a life become stale and unprofitable in the present, and with no outlook for the future. She had nothing to look for, nothing to expect from chance, for there are lives in which chance plays no part. But when the empire was in the full noonday of glory, and Napoleon was sending the flower of his troops to the peninsula, her disappointed hopes revived. Natural curiosity prompted her to make an effort to see the heroes who were conquering Europe in obedience to a word from the emperor in the order of the day, the heroes of a modern time who outdid the mythical feats of paladins of old. The cities of France, however avaricious or refractory, must perforce do honor to the imperial guard, and mayors and prefects went out to meet them with set speeches as if the conquerors had been crowned kings. Mme. de Bargeton went to a ridotto given to the town by a regiment, and fell in love with an officer of a good family, a sublieutenant, to whom the crafty Napoleon had given a glimpse of the baton of a Marshal of France. Love, restrained, greater and nobler than the ties that were made and unmade so easily in those days, was consecrated coldly by the hands of death. On the battlefield of Wagram a shell shattered the only record of Mme. de Bargeton's young beauty, a portrait worn on the heart of the Marquis of Cantaicourt. For long afterwards she wept for the young soldier, the colonel in his second campaign, for the heart hot with love and glory that set a letter from Nice above imperial favor. The pain of those days cast a veil of sadness over her face, a shadow that only vanished at the terrible age when a woman first discovers with dismay that the best years of her life are over, and she has had no joy of them, when she sees her roses wither, and the longing for love is revived again with the desire to linger yet for a little on the last smiles of youth. Her nobler qualities dealt so many wounds to her soul at the moment when the cold of the provinces seized upon her. She would have died of grief like the ermine if by chance she had been sullied by contact with those men whose thoughts are bent on winning a few sous nightly at cards after a good dinner. Pride saved her from the shabby love intrigues of the provinces. A woman so much above the level of those about her, forced to decide between the emptiness of the men whom she meets and the emptiness of her own life, can make but one choice. Marriage and society became a cloister for Onoре. She lived by poetry as the Carmelite lives by religion. All the famous foreign books published in France for the first time between 1815 and 1821, the great essayists, M. de Bonald and M. de Maistre, those two eagles of thought, all the lighter French literature, in short, that appeared during that sudden outburst of first vigorous growth might bring delight into her solitary life, but not flexibility of mind or body. She stood strong and straight like some forest tree, lightning blasted but still erect. Her dignity became a stilted manner, her social supremacy led her into affectation and sentimental over-refinements, she queened it with her foibles, after the usual fashion of those who allow their courtiers to adore them. This was Mme. de Bargeton's past life, a dreary chronicle which must be given if Lucien's position with regard to the lady is to be comprehensible. Lucien's introduction came about oddly enough. In the previous winter a newcomer had brought some interest into Mme. de Bargeton's monotonous life. The place of Controller of Excise fell vacant, and M. de Barante appointed a man whose adventurous life was a sufficient passport to the house of the sovereign lady who had her share of feminine curiosity. M. de Châtelet. He began life as plain fixed Châtelet, but since 1806 had the wit to adopt the particle M. Du Châtelet was one of the agreeable young men who escaped conscription after conscription by keeping very close to the imperial sun. He had begun his career as private secretary to an imperial highness, a post for which he possessed every qualification. Personable and of a good figure, a clever billiard player, a passable amateur actor, he danced well, and excelled in most physical exercises. He could, moreover, sing a ballad and applaud a witticism. Supple, envious, never at a loss, there was nothing that he did not know, nothing that he really knew. He knew nothing, for instance, of music, but he could sit down to the piano and accompany, after a fashion, a woman who consented after much pressing to sing a ballad learned by heart in a month of hard practice. Incapable though he was of any feeling for poetry, he would boldly ask permission to retire for 10 minutes to compose an impromptu, and return with a quatrain, flat as a pancake, wherein rhyme did duty for reason. Du Châtelet had besides a very pretty talent for filling in the ground of the Princess worsted work after the flowers had been begun. He held her skeins of silk with infinite grace, entertained her with dubious nothings more or less transparently veiled. He was ignorant of painting, but he could copy a landscape, sketch a head in profile, or design a costume and color it. He had, in short, all the little talents that a man could turn to such useful account in times when women exercised more influence in public life than most people imagine. Diplomacy he claimed to be his strong point. It usually is with those who have no knowledge, and are profound by reason of their emptiness, and, indeed, this kind of skill possesses one signal advantage, for it can only be displayed in the conduct of the affairs of the great, and when discretion is the quality required, a man who knows nothing can safely say nothing, and take refuge in a mysterious shake of the head. In fact, the cleverest practitioner is he who can swim with the current and keep his head well above the stream of events which he appears to control. A man's fitness for this business varying inversely as his specific gravity. But in this particular art or craft, as in all others, you shall find 1,000 mediocrities for one man of genius, and in spite of Châtelet's services, ordinary and extraordinary, Her Imperial Highness could not procure a seat in the Privy Council for her private secretary. Not that he would not have made a delightful master of requests, like many another, but the princess was of the opinion that her secretary was better placed with her than anywhere else in the world. He was made a baron, however, and went to Cassel as envoy extraordinary, no empty form of words, for he cut a very extraordinary figure there. Napoleon used him as a diplomatic courier in the thick of a European crisis. Just as he had been promised the post of minister to Jerome in Westphalia, the empire fell to pieces, and balked of his ambassadeur de famille as he called it, he went off in despair to Egypt with General de Montriveau. A strange chapter of accidents separated him from his traveling companion, and for 2 long years Six du Châtelet led a wandering life among the Arab tribes of the desert, who sold and resold their captive, his talents being not of the slightest use to the nomad tribes. At length, about the time that Montriveau reached Tangier, Châtelet found himself in the territory of the Imam of Muscat, had the luck to find an English vessel just about to set sail, and so came back to Paris a year sooner than his sometime companion. Once in Paris, his recent misfortunes, and certain connections of long standing, together with services rendered to great persons now in power, recommended him to the President of the Council, who put him in M. de Barant's department until such time as a controllership should fall vacant. So the part that M. du Châtelet once had played in the history of the imperial princess, his reputation for success with women, the strange story of his travels and sufferings, all awakened the interest of the ladies of Angoulême. Le Baron Six du Châtelet informed himself as to the manners and customs of the upper town, and took his cue accordingly. He appeared on the scene as a jaded man of the world, broken in health, and weary in spirit. He would raise his hand to his forehead at all seasons, as if pain never gave him a moment's respite, a habit that recalled his travels and made him interesting. He was on visiting terms with the authorities, the general in command, the prefect, the receiver general, and the bishop, but in every house he was frigid, polite, and slightly supercilious, like a man out of his proper place awaiting the favors of power. His social talents he left to conjecture, nor did they lose anything in reputation on that account. Then when people began to talk about him and wished to know him, and curiosity was still lively, when he had reconnoitred the men and found them naught, and studied the women with the eyes of experience in the cathedral for several Sundays, he saw that Mme. de Bargeton was the person with whom it would be best to be on intimate terms. Music, he thought, should open the doors of a house where strangers were never received. Surreptitiously he procured one of Miroya's masses, learned it upon the piano, and one fine Sunday when all Angoulême went to the cathedral, he played the organ, sent those who knew no better into ecstasies over the performance, and stimulated the interest felt in him by allowing his name to slip out through the attendance. As he came out after Mass, Mme. de Bargeton complimented him, regretting that she had no opportunity of playing duets with such a musician, and naturally, during an interview of her own seeking, he received the passport, which he could not have obtained if he had asked for it. So the adroit Baron was admitted to the circle of the Queen of Angoulême, and paid her marked attention. The elderly beau, he was 45 years old, saw that all her youth lay dormant and ready to revive, saw treasures to be turned to account, and possibly a rich widow to wed, to say nothing of expectations. It would be a marriage into the family of Nègrepelisse, and for him this meant a family connection with the Marquise d'Espard, and a political career in Paris. Here was a fair tree to cultivate in spite of the ill-omened, unsightly mistletoe that grew thick upon it. He would hang his fortunes upon it, and prune it, and wait till he could gather its golden fruit. High-born Angoulême shrieked against the introduction of a giaour into the sanctuary, for Mme. de Bargeton's salon was a kind of holy of holies in a society that kept itself unspotted from the world. The only outsider intimate there was the bishop. The prefect was admitted twice or thrice in a year. The receiver general was never received at all. Mme. de Bargeton would go to concerts and at homes at his house, but she never accepted invitations to dinner. And now, she who had declined to open her doors to the receiver general, welcomed a mere controller of excise. Here was a novel order of precedence for snubbed authority, such a thing it had never entered their minds to conceive. Those who by dint of mental effort can understand a kind of pettiness which, for that matter, can be found on any and every social level, will realize the awe with which the bourgeoisie of Angoulême regarded the Hôtel de Bargeton. The inhabitant of L'Houmeau beheld the grandeur of that miniature Louvre, the glory of the Angoumousine Hôtel de Rambouillet, shining at a solar distance, and yet, within it there was gathered together all the direst intellectual poverty, all the decayed gentility from 20 leagues round about. Political opinion expanded itself in wordy commonplaces vociferated with emphasis. The Quotidienne was comparatively Laodicean in its loyalty, and Louis XVIII a Jacobin. The women, for the most part, were awkward, silly, insipid, and ill-dressed. There was always something amiss that spoiled the whole. Nothing in 'em was complete, toilette or talk, flesh or spirit. But for his designs on Mme. de Bargeton, Châtelet could not have endured the society. And yet the manners and spirit of the noble in his ruined manor house, the knowledge of the traditions of good breeding, these things covered a multitude of deficiencies. Nobility of feeling was far more real here than in the lofty world of Paris. You might compare these country royalists, if the metaphor may be allowed, to old-fashioned silver plate, antiquated and tarnished, but weighty. Their attachment to the House of Bourbon as the House of Bourbon did them honor. The very fixity of their political opinions was a sort of faithfulness. The distance that they set between themselves and the bourgeoisie, their very exclusiveness, gave them a certain elevation, and enhanced their value. Each noble represented a certain price for the townsman, as Bambara Negroes, we are told, attach a money value to cowrie shells. Some of the women, flattered by M. du Châtelet, discerned in him the superior qualities lacking in the men of their own sect, and the insurrection of self-love was pacified. These ladies all hoped to succeed to the Imperial Highness. Purists were of the opinion that you might see the intruder in Mme. de Bargeton's house, but not elsewhere. Du Châtelet was fain to put up with a good deal of insolence, but he held his ground by cultivating the clergy. He encouraged the Queen of Angoulême in foibles bred of the soil, he brought her all the newest books, he read aloud the poetry that appeared. Together they went into ecstasies over these poets, she in all sincerity, he with suppressed yawns, but he bore with the romantics with a patience hardly to be expected of a man of the imperial school, who scarcely could make out what the young writers meant. Not so Mme. de Bargeton, she waxed enthusiastic over the Renaissance, due to the return of the Bourbon lilies, she loved M. de Chateaubriand for calling Victor Hugo a sublime child. It depressed her that she could only know genius from afar, she sighed for Paris, where great men live. For these reasons M. du Châtelet thought he had done a wonderfully clever thing when he told the lady that at that moment in Angoulême there was another sublime child, a young poet, a rising star whose glory surpassed the whole Parisian galaxy, though he knew it not. A great man of the future had been born in Lumo. The headmaster of the school had shown the Baron some admirable verses. The poor and humble lad was a second Chatterton, with none of the political baseness and ferocious hatred of the great ones of earth that led his English prototype to turn pamphleteer and revile his benefactors. Mme. de Bargeton in her little circle of 5 or 6 persons, who was supposed to share her tastes for art and letters, because this one scraped a fiddle, and that splashed sheets of white paper, more or less, with sepia, and the other was president of a local agricultural society, or was gifted with a bass voice that rendered che fiato in corpo like a war whoop. Mme. de Bargeton amid these grotesque figures was like a famished actor set down to a stage dinner of pasteboard. No words, therefore, can describe her joy at these tidings. She must see this poet, this angel. She raved about him, went into raptures, talked of him for whole hours together. Before 2 days were out, the sometime diplomatic courier had negotiated through the headmaster for Lucien's appearance in the Hôtel de Bargeton. Poor helots of the provinces, for whom the distances between class and class are so far greater than for the Parisian, for whom, indeed, these distances visibly lessen day by day, souls so grievously oppressed by the social barriers behind which all sorts and conditions of men sit crying Raka, with mutual anathemas, you, and you alone, will fully comprehend the ferment in Lucien's heart and brain, when his awe-inspiring headmaster told him that the great gates of the Hôtel de Bargeton would shortly open and turn upon their hinges at his fame. Lucien and David, walking together of an evening in the Promenade de Bully, had looked up at the house with the old-fashioned gables, and wondered whether their names would ever so much as reach ears inexorably deaf to knowledge that came from a lowly origin, and now he, Lucien, was to be made welcome there. No one except his sister was in the secret. Eve, like the thrifty housekeeper and divine magician that she was, conjured up a few louis d'or from her savings to buy thin shoes for Lucien of the best shoemaker in Angoulême, and an entirely new suit of clothes from the most renowned tailor. She made a frill for his best shirt, and washed and pleated it with her own hands. And how pleased she was to see him so dressed. How proud she felt of her brother, and what quantities of advice she gave him. Her intuition foresaw countless foolish fears. Lucien had a habit of resting his elbows on the table when he was in deep thought. He would even go so far as to draw a table nearer to lean upon it. Eve told him that he must not forget himself in those aristocratic precincts. She went with him as far as St. Peter's Gate, and when they were almost opposite the cathedral she stopped, and watched him pass down the Rue de Bully to the promenade, where M. du Châtelet was waiting for him. And after he was out of sight, she still stood there, poor girl, in a great tremor of emotion, as though some great thing had happened to them. Lucien in Mme. de Bargeton's house. For Eve it meant the dawn of success. The innocent creature did not suspect that where ambition begins, ingenuous feeling ends. Externals in the Rue du Minage gave Lucien no sense of surprise. This palace, that loomed so large in his imagination, was a house built of the soft stone of the country, mellowed by time. It looked dismal enough from the street, and inside it was extremely plain. There was the usual provincial courtyard, chilly, prim, and neat, and the house itself was sober, almost convent-like, but in good repair. Lucien went up the old staircase with the balustrade of chestnut wood. The stone steps ceased after the second floor, crossed a shabby antechamber, and came into the presence in a little wainscoted drawing-room, beyond a dimly lit salon. The carved woodwork, in the taste of the 18th century, had been painted grey. There were monochrome paintings on the frieze panels, and the walls were adorned with crimson damask with a meager border. The old-fashioned furniture shrank piteously from sight under covers of a red and white check pattern. On the sofa, covered with thin mattress cushions, sat Mme de Bargeton. The poet beheld her by the light of 2 wax candles on a sconce with a screen fitted to it, that stood before her on a round table with a green cloth. The queen did not attempt to rise, but she twisted very gracefully on her seat, smiling on the poet, who was not a little fluttered by the serpentine quiverings. Her manner was distinguished, he thought. For Mme de Bargeton, she was impressed with Lucien's extreme beauty, with his diffidence, with everything about him. For her the poet already was poetry incarnate. Lucien scrutinized his hostess with discreet side glances. She disappointed none of his expectations of a great lady. Mme de Bargeton, following a new fashion, wore a coif of slashed black velvet, a headdress that recalls memories of medieval legend to a young imagination, to amplify, as it were, the dignity of womanhood. Her red-gold hair, escaping from under her cap, hung loose, bright golden color in the light, red in the rounded shadow of the curls that only partially hid her neck. Beneath a massive white brow, clean-cut and strongly outlined, shone a pair of bright gray eyes encircled by a margin of mother-of-pearl, 2 blue veins on each side of the nose bringing out the whiteness of that delicate setting. The Bourbon curve of the nose added to the ardent expression of an oval face. It was as if the royal temper of the House of Con shone conspicuous in this feature. The careless crossed folds of the bodice left a white throat bare, and half revealed the outlines of a still youthful figure and shapely, well-placed contours beneath. With fingers tapering and well kept, though somewhat too thin, Mme de Bargeton amiably pointed to a seat by her side. M. du Châtelet ensconced himself in an easy-chair, and Lucien then became aware that there was no one else in the room. Mme de Bargeton's words intoxicated the young poet from Lumo. For Lucien, those 3 hours spent in her presence went by like a dream that we would fain have last forever. She was not thin, he thought, she was slender, in love with love, and loveless, and delicate in spite of her strength. Her foibles, exaggerated by her manner, took his fancy, for youth sets out with a love of hyperbole, that infirmity of noble souls. He did not so much as see that her cheeks were faded, that the patches of color on the cheekbone were faded and hardened to a brick red by listless days and a certain amount of ailing health. His imagination fastened at once on the glowing eyes, on the dainty curls rippling with light, on the dazzling fairness of her skin, and hovered about those bright points as the moth hovers about the candle flame. For her spirit made such appeal to his that he could no longer see the woman as she was. Her feminine exaltation had carried him away, the energy of her expressions, a little styled in truth by pretty hard and constant wear, but new to Lucien, fascinated him so much the more easily because he was determined to be pleased. He had brought none of his own verses to read, but nothing was said of them. He had purposely left them behind because he meant to return, and Mme. de Bargeton did not ask for them, because she meant that he should come back some future day to read them to her. Was not this a beginning of an understanding? As for M6 du Châtelet, he was not over well pleased with all this. He perceived rather too late in the day that he had a rival in this handsome young fellow. He went with him as far as the first flight of steps below Beaulieu to try the effect of a little diplomacy, and Lucien was not a little astonished when he heard the controller of excise pluming himself on having effected the introduction, and proceeding in this character to give him, Lucien, the benefit of his advice. Heaven send that Lucien might meet with better treatment than he had done, such was the matter of M. du Châtelet's discourse. The court was less insolent than this pack of dolts in Angoulême. You were expected to endure deadly insults, the superciliousness you had to put up with was something abominable. If this kind of folk did not alter their behavior, there would be another revolution of '89. As for himself, if he continued to go to the house, it was because he had found Mme. de Bargeton to his taste. She was the only woman worth troubling about in Angoulême. He had been paying court to her for want of anything better to do, and now he was desperately in love with her. She would be his before very long, she loved him, everything pointed that way. The conquest of this haughty queen of the society would be his one revenge on the whole houseful of booby clodpates. Châtelet talked of his passion in the tone of a man who would have a rival's life if he crossed his path. The elderly butterfly of the empire came down with his whole weight on the poor poet, and tried to frighten and crush him by his self-importance. He grew taller as he gave an embellished account of his perilous wanderings, but while he impressed the poet's imagination, the lover was by no means afraid of him. In spite of the elderly coxcomb, and regardless of his threats and airs of a bourgeois bravo, Lucien went back again and again to the house, not too often at first, as became a man of L'Humour, but before very long he grew accustomed to the vast condescension, as it had seemed to him at the outset, and came more and more frequently. The druggist's son was a completely insignificant being. If any of the noblesse, men or women, calling upon Nice, found Lucien in the room, they met him with the overwhelming graciousness that well-bred people use towards their inferiors. Lucien thought them very kind for a time, and later found out the real reason for their specious amiability. It was not long before he detected a patronizing tone that stirred his gall and confirmed him in his bitter republicanism, a phase of opinion through which many a would-be patrician passes by way of prelude to his introduction to polite society. But was there anything that he would not have endured for Nice, for so he heard her named by the clan. Like Spanish grandees and the old Austrian nobility at Vienna, these folk, men and women alike, called each other by their Christian names, a final shade of distinction in the inmost ring of Angmauchian aristocracy. Lucien loved Nice as a young man loves the first woman who flatters him, for Nice prophesied great things and boundless fame for Lucien. She used all her skill to secure her hold upon her poet. Not merely did she exalt him beyond measure, but she represented him to himself as a child without fortune whom she meant to start in life. She treated him like a child, to keep him near her. She made him her reader, her secretary, and cared more for him than she would have thought possible after the dreadful calamity that had befallen her. She was very cruel to herself in those days, telling herself that it would be folly to love a young man of 20, so far apart from her socially in the first place, and her behavior to him was a bewildering mixture of familiarity and capricious fits of pride arising from her fears and scruples. She was sometimes a lofty patroness, sometimes she was tender and flattered him. At first, while he was overawed by her rank, Lucien experienced the extremes of dread, hope, and despair, the torture of a first love that is beaten deep into the heart with the hammer strokes of alternate bliss and anguish. For 2 months Mme. de Bargeton was for him a benefactress who would take a mother's interest in him, but confidences came next. Mme. de Bargeton began to address her poet as "Dear Lucien," and then as "Dear," without more ado. The poet grew bolder, and addressed the great lady as "Nice," and there followed a flash of anger that captivates a boy. She reproached him for calling her by a name in everybody's mouth. The haughty and high-born Negropolis offered the fair angel youth that one of her appellations which was unsoiled by use, for him she would be Louise. Lucien was in the third heaven. One evening when Lucien came in, he found Mme. de Bargeton looking at a portrait, which she promptly put away. He wished to see it, and to quiet the despair of a first fit of jealousy Louise showed him Cantecoire's picture, and told with tears the piteous story of a love so stainless, so cruelly cut short. Was she experimenting with herself? Was she trying a first unfaithfulness to the memory of the dead? Or had she taken it into her head to raise up a rival to Lucien in the portrait? Lucien was too much of a boy to analyze his lady-love. He gave way to unfeigned despair when she opened the campaign by entrenching herself behind the more or less skillfully devised scruples which women raise to have them batted down. When a woman begins to talk about her duty, regard for appearances or religion, the objections she raises are so many redoubts which she loves to have carried by storm. But on the guileless Lucien these coquetries were thrown away, he would have advanced of his own accord. "I shall not die for you, I will live for you," he cried audaciously one evening. He meant to have no more of M. de Cantecoire, and gave Louise a glance which told plainly that a crisis was at hand. Startled at the progress of this new love in herself and her poet, Louise demanded some verses promised for the first page of her album, looking for a pretext for a quarrel in his tardiness. But what became of her when she read the following stanzas, which, naturally, she considered finer than the finest work of Canales, the poet of the aristocracy? Was it really I who inspired those lines, she asked. The doubt suggested by coquetry to a woman who amused herself by playing with fire brought tears to Lucien's eyes, but her first kiss upon his forehead calmed the storm. Decidedly Lucien was a great man, and she meant to form him. She thought of teaching him Italian and German and perfecting his manners. That would be pretext sufficient for having him constantly with her under the very eyes of her tiresome courtiers. What an interest in her life! She took up music again for her poet Sake, and revealed the world of sound to him, playing grand fragments of Beethoven till she sent him into ecstasy, and, happy in his delight, turned to the half-swooning poet. "Is not such happiness as this enough?" she asked hypocritically, and poor Lucien was stupid enough to answer, "Yes." In the previous week things had reached such a point, that Louise had judged it expedient to ask Lucien to dine with M. de Bargeton as a third. But in spite of this precaution, the whole town knew the state of affairs, and so extraordinary did it appear, that no one would believe the truth. The outcry was terrific. Some were of the opinion that society was on the eve of cataclysm. "See what comes of liberal doctrines," cried others. Then it was that the jealous Du Châtelet discovered that Madame Charlotte, the monthly nurse, was no other than Mme. Chardin, the mother of the Chateaubriand of Lumeau, as he put it. The remark passed muster as a joke. Mme. de Chandor was the first to hurry to Mme. de Bargeton. "Nice, dear," she said, "do you know what everybody is talking about in Angoulême?" "This little rimster's mother is the Madame Charlotte who nursed my sister-in-law through her confinement 2 months ago." "What is there extraordinary in that, my dear?" asked Mme. de Bargeton with her most regal air. "She is a druggist's widow, is she not?" "A poor fate for a Rubempre." Suppose that you and I had not a penny in the world, what should either of us do for a living? How would you support your children? Mme. de Bargeton's presence of mind put an end to the Jeremiads of the noblesse. Great natures are prone to make a virtue of misfortune, and there is something irresistibly attractive about well-doing when persisted in through evil report. Innocence has the piquancy of the forbidden. Mme. de Bargeton's rooms were crowded that evening with friends who came to remonstrate with her. She brought her most caustic wit into play. She said that as noble families could not produce a Molière, a Racine, a Rousseau, a Voltaire, a Massillon, a Beaumarchais, or a Diderot, people must make up their minds to it, and accept the fact that great men had upholsterers and clockmakers and cutlers for their fathers. She said that genius was always noble. She railed at boorish squires for understanding their real interests so imperfectly. In short, she talked a good deal of nonsense, which would have let the light into heads less dense, but left her audience agape at her eccentricity. And in these ways she conjured away the storm with her heavy artillery. When Lucien, obedient to her request, appeared for the first time in the faded great drawing-room, where the whist tables were set out, she welcomed him graciously, and brought him forward, like a queen who means to be obeyed. She addressed the Controller of Excise as M. Châtelet, and left that gentleman thunderstruck by the discovery that she knew about the illegal superfetation of the particle. Lucien was forced upon her circle, and was received as a poisonous element, which every person in it vowed to expel with the antidote of insolence. Nice had won a victory, but she had lost her supremacy of empire. There was a rumor of insurrection. Amélie, otherwise Mme. de Chandor, hearkening to M. Châtelet's counsels, determined to erect a rival altar by receiving on Wednesdays. Now Mme. de Bargeton's salon was open every evening, and those who frequented it were so wedded to their ways, so accustomed to meet about the same tables, to play the familiar game of backgammon, to see the same faces and the same candle sconces night after night, and afterwards to cloak and shawl, and put on overshoes and hats in the old corridor, that they were quite as much attached to the steps of the staircase as to the mistress of the house. All resigned themselves to endure the songster chardonneret of the sacred grove, said Alexandre de Brebian, which was witticism number 2. Finally, the president of the Agricultural Society put an end to the sedition by remarking judicially that before the Revolution the greatest nobles admitted men like Dulcos and Grimm and Crebillon to the society, men who were nobodies, like this little poet of Lumeau, but one thing they never did, they never received tax collectors, and, after all, Châtelet is only a tax collector. Du Châtelet suffered for Chardon. Everyone turned the cold shoulder upon him, and Châtelet was conscious that he was attacked. When Mme. de Bargeton called him M. Châtelet, he swore to himself that he would possess her, and now he entered into the views of the mistress of the house, came to the support of the young poet, and declared himself Lucien's friend. The great diplomatist, overlooked by the short-sighted emperor, made much of Lucien, and declared himself his friend. To launch the poet into society, he gave a dinner, and asked all the authorities to meet him: the prefect, the receiver general, the colonel in command of the garrison, the head of the naval school, the president of the court, and so forth. The poet, poor fellow, was fated so magnificently, and so belauded, that anybody but a young man of 22 would have shrewdly suspected a hoax. After dinner, Châtelet drew his rival on to recite the dying Sardanapalus, the masterpiece of the hour, and the headmaster of the school, a man of a phlegmatic temperament, applauded with both hands, and vowed that Jean-Baptiste Rousseau had done nothing finer. Sixth, Baron du Châtelet, thought in his heart that this slip of a rimster would wither incontinently in a hothouse of adulation. Perhaps he hoped that when the poet's head was turned with brilliant dreams, he would indulge in some impertinence that would promptly consign him to the obscurity from which he had emerged. Pending the decease of genius, Châtelet appeared to offer up his hopes as a sacrifice at Mme. de Bargeton's feet, but with the ingenuity of a rake, he kept his own plan in abeyance, watching the lover's movements with keenly critical eyes, and waiting for the opportunity of ruining Lucien. From this time forward, vague rumors reported the existence of a great man in Angoumois. Mme. de Bargeton was praised on all sides for the interest which she took in this young eagle. No sooner was her conduct approved than she tried to win a general sanction. She announced a soirée, with ices, tea, and cakes, a great innovation in a city where tea, as yet, was sold only by druggists as a remedy for indigestion. The flower of Angoumoisian aristocracy was summoned to hear Lucien read his great work. Louise had hidden all the difficulties from her friend, but she let fall a few words touching the social cabal formed against him. She would not have him ignorant of the perils besetting his career as a man of genius, nor of the obstacles insurmountable to weaklings. She drew a lesson from the recent victory. Her white hands pointed him to glory that lay beyond a prolonged martyrdom. She spoke of steaks and flaming pyres, she spread the adjectives thickly on her finest tartines, and decorated them with a variety of her most pompous epithets. It was an infringement of the copyright of the passages of declamation that disfigure Corinne, but Louise grew so much the greater in her own eyes as she talked, that she loved the Benjamin who inspired her eloquence the more for it. She counselled him to take a bold step and renounce his patronymic for the noble name of Rubempre. He need not mind the little tittle-tattle over a change which the king, for that matter, would authorize. Mme. de Bargeton undertook to procure this favour. She was related to the Marquise d'Espard, who was a Blamont Chauvry before her marriage, and a persona grata at court. The words "King, Marquise d'Espard" and "the court" dazzled Lucien like a blaze of fireworks, and the necessity of the baptism was plain to him. "Dear child," said Louise, with tender mockery in her tones, "the sooner it is done, the sooner it will be sanctioned." She went through social strata and showed the poet that this step would raise him many rungs higher in the ladder. Seizing the moment, she persuaded Lucien to forswear the chimerical notions of 89 as to equality. She roused a thirst for social distinction allayed by David's cool common sense. She pointed out fashionable society as the goal and the only stage for such a talent as his. The rabid liberal became a monarchist in petto. Lucien set his teeth in the apple of desire of rank, luxury, and fame. He swore to win a crown to lay at his lady's feet, even if there should be bloodstains on the baize. He would conquer at any cost, quibuscumque vis. To prove his courage, he told her of his present way of life. Louise had known nothing of its hardships, for there is an indefinable pudency inseparable from strong feeling in youth, a delicacy which shrinks from a display of great qualities, and a young man loves to have the real quality of his nature discerned through the incognito. He described that life, the shackles of poverty borne with pride, his days of work for David, his nights of study. His young ardor recalled memories of the Colonel of 6 and 20, mme. De Bargeton's eyes grew soft, and Lucien, seeing this weakness in his awe-inspiring mistress, seized a hand that she had abandoned to him, and kissed it with the frenzy of a lover and a poet in his youth. Louise even allowed him to set his eager, quivering lips upon her forehead. "Oh, child, child, if anyone should see us, I should look very ridiculous," she said, shaking off the ecstatic torpor. In the course of that evening, mme. De Bargeton's wit made havoc of Lucien's prejudices, as she styled them. Men of genius, according to her doctrine, had neither brothers nor sisters nor father nor mother. The great tasks laid upon them required that they should sacrifice everything that they might grow to their full stature. Perhaps their families might suffer at first from the all-absorbing exactions of a giant brain, but at a later day they were repaid 100-fold for self-denial of every kind. During the early struggles of the kingly intellect with adverse fate, they shared the spoils of victory. Genius was answerable to no man. Genius alone could judge of the means used to an end which no one else could know. It was the duty of a man of genius, therefore, to set himself above law. It was his mission to reconstruct law. The man who is master of his age may take all that he needs, run any risks, for all is his. She quoted instances. Bernard Palissy, Louis XI, Fox, Napoleon, Christopher Columbus, and Julius Caesar, all these world-famous gamblers had begun life hampered with debt, or as poor men. All of them had been misunderstood, taken for madmen, reviled for bad sons, bad brothers, bad fathers, and yet in after life each one had come to be the pride of his family, of his country, of the civilized world. Her arguments fell upon fertile soil in the worst of Lucien's nature, and spread corruption in his heart. For him, when his desires were hot, all means were admissible. But failure is high treason against society, and when the fallen conqueror has run amok through bourgeois virtues, and pulled down the pillars of society, small wonder that society, finding Marius seated among the ruins, should drive him forth in abhorrence. All unconsciously Lucien stood with the palm of genius on the one hand and a shameful ending in the hulks upon the other, and, on high upon the Sinai of the prophets, beheld no Dead Sea covering the cities of the plain, the hideous winding sheet of Gomorrah. So well did Louise loosen the swaddling bands of provincial life that confined the heart and brain of her poet that the said poet determined to try an experiment upon her. He wished to feel certain that this proud conquest was his without laying himself open to the mortification of a rebuff. The forthcoming soirée gave him his opportunity. Ambition blended with his love. He loved, and he meant to rise, a double desire not unnatural in young men with a heart to satisfy and the battle of life to fight. Society, summoning all her children to one banquet, arouses ambition in the very morning of life. Youth is robbed of its charm, and generous thoughts are corrupted by mercenary scheming. The idealist would fain have it otherwise, but intrusive fact too often gives the lie to the fiction which we should like to believe, making it impossible to paint the young man of the 19th century other than he is. Lucien imagined that his scheming was entirely prompted by good feeling, and persuaded himself that it was done solely for his friend David's sake. He wrote a long letter to his Louise. He felt bolder, pen in hand, than face to face. In a dozen sheets, copied out 3 several times, he told her of his father's genius and blighted hopes and of his grinding poverty. He described his beloved sister as an angel, and David as another Cuvier, a great man of the future, and a father, friend, and brother to him in the present. He should feel himself unworthy of his Louise's love, his proudest distinction, if he did not ask her to do for David all that she had done for him. He would give up everything rather than desert David Setchard. David must witness his success. It was one of those wild letters in which a young man points a pistol at a refusal, letters full of boyish casuistry and the incoherent reasoning of an idealist, a delicious tissue of words embroidered here and there by the naive utterances that women love so well, unconscious revelations of the writer's heart. Lucien left the letter with the housemaid, went to the office, and spent the day in reading proofs, superintending the execution of orders, and looking after the affairs of the printing house. He said not a word to David. While youth bears a child's heart, it is capable of sublime reticence. Perhaps, too, Lucien began to dread the Phocian's axe which David could wield when he chose. Perhaps he was afraid to meet those clear-sighted eyes that read the depths of his soul. But when he read Chénier's poems with David, his secret rose from his heart to his lips at the sting of a reproach that he felt as the patient feels the probing of a wound. And now try to understand the thoughts that troubled Lucien's mind as he went down from Angoulême. Was the great lady angry with him? Would she receive David? Had he, Lucien, in his ambition, flung himself headlong back into the depths of L'Humeau? Before he set that kiss on Louise's forehead, he had had time to measure the distance between a queen and her favorite. So far had he come in 5 months, and he did not tell himself that David could cross over the same ground in a moment. Yet he did not know how completely the lower orders were excluded from this upper world. He did not so much as suspect that a second experiment of this kind meant ruin for Mme. de Bargeton. Once accused and fairly convicted of a liking for canaille, Louise would be driven from the place, her caste would shun her as men shunned a leper in the Middle Ages. Knives might have broken the moral law, and her whole circle, the clergy and the flower of the aristocracy, would have defended her against the world through thick and thin, but a breach of another law, the offense of admitting all sorts of people to her house, this was sin without remission. The sins of those in power are always overlooked. Once let them abdicate, and they shall pay the penalty. And what was it but abdication to receive David? But if Lucien did not see these aspects of the question, his aristocratic instinct discerned plenty of difficulties of another kind, and he took alarm. A fine manner is not the invariable outcome of noble feeling, and while no man at court had a nobler air than Racine, Corneille looked very much like a cattle dealer, and Descartes might have been taken for an honest Dutch merchant, and visitors to La Brede, meeting Montesquieu in a cotton nightcap, carrying a rake over his shoulder, mistook him for a gardener. A knowledge of the world, when it is not sucked in with mother's milk and part of the inheritance of descent, is only acquired by education, supplemented by certain gifts of chance, a graceful figure, distinction of feature, a certain ring in the voice. All these, so important trifles, David lacked, while nature had bestowed them upon his friend. Of gentle blood on the mother's side, Lucien was a Frank, even down to the high-arched instep. David had inherited the physique of his father the pressman and the flat foot of the Gael. Lucien could hear the shower of jokes at David's expense, he could see Mme. de Bargeton's repressed smile, and at length, without being exactly ashamed of his brother, he made up his mind to disregard his first impulse and to think twice before yielding to it in future. So, after the hour of poetry and self-sacrifice, after the reading of verse that opened out before the friends the fields of literature in the light of a newly risen sun, the hour of worldly wisdom and of scheming struck for Lucien. Down once more in Lumo, he wished that he had not written that letter, he wished he could have it back again, for down the vista of the future he caught a glimpse of the inexorable laws of the world. He guessed that nothing succeeds like success, and it cost him something to step down from the first rung of the scaling ladder by which he meant to reach and storm the heights above. Pictures of his quiet and simple life rose before him, pictures fair with the brightest colors of blossoming love. There was David, what a genius David had, David who had helped him so generously, and would die for him at need. He thought of his mother, of how great a lady she was in her lowly lot, and how she thought that he was as good as he was clever, then of his sister so gracious in submission to her fate, of his own innocent childhood and conscience as yet unstained, of budding hopes undespoiled by rough winds, and at these thoughts the past broke into flowers once more for his memory. Then he told himself that it was a far finer thing to hew his own way through serried hostile mobs of aristocrats or Philistines by repeated successful strokes, than to reach the goal through a woman's favor. Sooner or later his genius should shine out. It had been so with the others, his predecessors. They had tamed society. Women would love him when that day came. The example of Napoleon, which, unluckily for this 19th century of ours, has filled a great many ordinary persons with aspirations after extraordinary destinies, the example of Napoleon occurred to Lucien's mind. He flung his schemes to the winds and blamed himself for thinking of them. For Lucien was so made that he went from evil to good, or from good to evil, with the same facility. Lucien had none of the scholar's love for his retreat. For the past month indeed he had felt something like shame at the sight of the shop front, where you could read Postel, late Chardin, pharmaceutical chemist, in yellow letters on a green ground. It was an offence to him that his father's name should be thus posted up in a place where every carriage passed. Every evening, when he closed the ugly iron gate and went up to Bewley to give his arm to Mme. de Bargeton among the dandies of the upper town, he chafed beyond all reason at the disparity between his lodging and his fortune. I love Mme. de Bargeton, perhaps in a few days she will be mine, yet here I live in this rat-hole, he said to himself this evening, as he went down the narrow passage into the little yard behind the shop. This evening bundles of boiled herbs were spread out along the wall, the apprentice was scouring a cauldron, and M. Postel himself, girded about with his laboratory apron, was standing with a retort in his hand, inspecting some chemical product while keeping an eye upon the shop door, or if the eye happened to be engaged, he had at any rate an ear for the bell. A strong scent of chamomile and peppermint pervaded the yard and the poor little dwelling at the side, which he reached by a short ladder, with a rope on either side by way of handrail. Lucien's room was an attic just under the roof. "Good day, Sonny," said M. Postel, that typical, provincial tradesman. "Are you pretty middling?" "I have just been experimenting on treacle, but it would take a man like your father to find what I am looking for." "Ah, he was a famous chemist, he was." "If I had only known his gout specific, you and I should be rolling along in our carriage this day." The little druggist, whose head was as thick as his heart was kind, never let a week pass without some allusion to Chardin Sr.'s unlucky secretiveness as to that discovery, words that Lucien felt like a stab. "It is a great pity," Lucien answered curtly. He was beginning to think his father's apprentice prodigiously vulgar, though he had blessed the man for his kindness, for honest Postel had helped his master's widow and children more than once. "Why, what is the matter with you?" M. Postel inquired, putting down his test tube on the laboratory table. "Is there a letter for me?" "Yes, a letter that smells like balm. It is lying on the corner near my desk." Mme. de Bargeton's letter lying among the physic bottles in a druggist's shop. Lucien sprang in to rescue it. "Be quick, Lucien, your dinner has been waiting an hour for you, it will be cold," a sweet voice called gently through a half-opened window, but Lucien did not hear. "That brother of yours has gone crazy, mademoiselle," said Postel, lifting his face. The old bachelor looked rather like a miniature brandy cask, embellished by a painter's fancy, with a fat, ruddy countenance much pitted with the smallpox. At the sight of Eve his face took a ceremonious and amiable expression, which said plainly that he had thoughts of espousing the daughter of his predecessor, but could not put an end to the strife between love and interest in his heart. He often said to Lucien, with a smile, "Your sister is uncommonly pretty, and you are not so bad looking neither." "Your father did everything well." Eve was tall, dark-haired, dark of complexion, and blue-eyed, but notwithstanding these signs of virile character, she was gentle, tender-hearted, and devoted to those she loved. Her frank innocence, her simplicity, her quiet acceptance of a hard-working life, her character for her life was above reproach could not fail to win David Sechet's heart. So, since the first time that these two had met, a repressed and single-hearted love had grown up between them in the German fashion, quietly, with no fervid protestations. In their secret souls they thought of each other as if there were a bar between that kept them apart, as if the thought were an offense against some jealous husband, and hid their feelings from Lucien as though their love in some way did him a wrong. David, moreover, had no confidence in himself, and could not believe that Eve could care for him. Eve was a penniless girl, and therefore shy. A real work girl would have been bolder, but Eve, gently bred, and fallen into poverty, resigned herself to her dreary lot. Diffident as she seemed, she was in reality proud, and would not make a single advance towards the son of a father said to be rich. People who knew the value of a growing property, said that the vineyard at Marsac was worth more than 80,000 francs, to say nothing of the traditional bits of land which old Sechet used to buy as they came into the market, for old Sechet had savings. He was lucky with his vintages, and a clever salesman. Perhaps David was the only man in Angoulême who knew nothing of his father's wealth. In David's eyes Marsac was a hovel bought in 1810 for 15 or 16,000 francs, a place that he saw once a year at vintage time when his father walked him up and down among the vines and boasted of an output of wine which the young printer never saw, and he cared nothing about it. David was a student leading a solitary life, and the love that gained even greater force in solitude, as he dwelt upon the difficulties in the way, was timid, and looked for encouragement, for David stood more in awe of Eve than a simple clerk of some high-born lady. He was awkward and ill at ease in the presence of his idol, and as eager to hurry away as he had been to come. He repressed his passion, and was silent. Often of an evening, on some pretext of consulting Lucien, he would leave the Place du Murier and go down through the Pallet Gate as far as Lumeau, but at the sight of the green iron railings his heart failed. Perhaps he had come too late, Eve might think him a nuisance, she would be in bed by this time no doubt, and so he turned back. But though his great love had only appeared in trifles, Eve read it clearly. She was proud, without a touch of vanity in her pride, of the deep reverence in David's looks and words and manner towards her, but it was the young printer's enthusiastic belief in Lucien that drew her to him most of all. He had divined the way to win Eve. The mute delights of this love of theirs differed from the transports of stormy passion, as wildflowers in the fields from the brilliant flowers in garden beds. Interchange of glances, delicate and sweet as blue water flowers on the surface of the stream, a look in either face, vanishing as swiftly as the scent of briar rose, melancholy, tender as the velvet of moss. These were the blossoms of two rare natures, springing up out of a rich and fruitful soil on foundations of rock. Many a time Eve had seen revelations of the strength that lay below the appearance of weakness, and made such full allowance for all that David left undone, that the slightest word now might bring about a closer union of soul and soul. Eve opened the door, and Lucien sat down without a word at the little table on an X-shaped trestle. There was no tablecloth, the poor little household boasted but 3 silver spoons and forks, and Eve had laid them all for the dearly loved brother. "What have you there?" she asked, when she had set a dish on the table, and put the extinguisher on the portable stove, where it had been kept hot for him. Lucien did not answer. Eve took up a little plate, daintily garnished with vine leaves, and set it on the table with a jug full of cream. "There, Lucien, I have had strawberries for you." But Lucien was so absorbed in his letter that he did not hear a word. Eve came to sit beside him without a murmur, for in a sister's love for a brother it is an element of great pleasure to be treated without ceremony. "Oh, what is it?" she cried as she saw tears shining in her brother's eyes. "Nothing, nothing, Eve," he said, and putting his arm about her waist, he drew her towards him and kissed her forehead, her hair, her throat, with warmth that surprised her. "You are keeping something from me." "Well, then she loves me." "I knew very well that you kissed me for somebody else," the poor sister pouted, flushing red. "We shall all be happy," cried Lucien, swallowing great spoonfuls of soup. "We," echoed Eve. The same presentiment that had crossed David's mind prompted her to add, "You will not care so much about us now." "How can you think that, if you know me?" Eve put out her hand and grasped his tightly, then she carried off the empty plate and the brown earthen soup tureen, and brought the dish that she had made for him. But instead of eating his dinner, Lucien read his letter over again, and Eve, discreet maiden, did not ask another question, respecting her brother's silence.